Today I'm going to talk about the brain running a simulation of the real world in order to predict the future, what what the consequences of that are. But don't confuse that with the Matrix style simulation that people like Elon Musk and others have proposed, because I I can't get my head around that. I mean, if we're all in a simulation, then why are we separate? I mean, why don't we be part of the simulation too? And therefore, there's no free will. So for me, that all gets too complicated. So why not ignore that as an issue? Say the real world is real, and then look about how we perceive that world. And that is what I want to talk about today. So let's try and explain what I mean. If you throw a ball at a person, then they work out where it is and then catch it. But what's happening in there is the brain actually takes 100 milliseconds to interpret the images. And by the way, the sound is done in less time. And so the brain actually, what it does is interpret the image, it marries that with the sound, and then adjusts the time, and then predicts where the ball is going to be, and then you catch it. This actually is the brain simulating the real world at a time in the future. So what I'm saying is the world that we perceive is a processed world. It's the real world going in through our senses, eyes and ears, and we interpret what's important in that input sensor data and then present that as some parameters for us to predict what the future is, where that ball is going to be. So in reality, the world that we're seeing is not the real world, it's an interpretation, it's a modification of that real world. And what's amazing is that in many ways we all people perceive the real world in a similar simplified view. I mean, the example is when you have an optical illusion, you're actually, generally people see the same optical illusion. And going back to our previous episode where we talked about nurture versus nature, it appears that perhaps there is some inbuilt way that we interpret things that's common amongst all people, and it's not learnt. So just to say that again, what we actually experience is not the real world. It's our interpretation, our brain's interpretation of that real world, and in some cases it's a prediction of that real world in the future. And a good way of looking at this is that this is where the simulation is. We are simulating, we're taking inputs and then simulating that world to understand where it will be in the future. So let's now introduce another idea, which is the conscious and the subconscious. The reason for this is there are certain things we experience which we're not consciously experiencing. In particular, when we interpret an image, the brain is doing various things, like it's doing edge detection in the image, it's working out where the shapes are, and then allocating, that's a face, that's a tree, and so on. We're allocating conceptual items to images, and all that is done actually by the subconscious. And it was either intrinsically there, that capability, when we were born, or we learnt it very early on. Other examples of subconscious learning are riding a bicycle or playing a musical instrument. What happens there is we can spend hours and hours learning to ride a bicycle when we're young, but after that point it becomes effortless. Once we've learned how to ride a bicycle, we know how to do it for life. When it comes to a musical instrument, it's far more complicated, and we have to practice hours and hours. Even an expert will practice for hours. But that activity is to make it a subconscious activity, so it becomes effortless on the night when you actually have to play in the real concert. So the act of conscious learning, where you start consciously practicing something, eventually, if you do it enough times, it becomes subconscious learning. It almost gets hardwired into the brain. It becomes a pattern which you can reuse in the future. When a pattern becomes out of the ordinary, when it's unexpected, then suddenly we start paying attention. As a baby, we'll suddenly pay attention and try and learn this new concept, this new pattern, effectively, that is in your experience. And this is very similar to the way a neural network is trained. We train the neural network with lots and lots of data, which has been categorized by humans, and that's called supervised learning. But then what people tend to do to make it even better is to have a simulation which takes that data and trains it with generated data. In a way, it train on more cycles and get to learn exactly how to do the activity. The example is to do self-driving software. What Google are doing is not only training it with real cars on real roads, but having a simulation of the roads and then training on the simulation. Similarly, when we go to sleep at night and dream, what could be happening there is we're running through various scenarios and events that have happened that day and processing them to try and train our brain how to react, how to respond to certain instances. So the thought is that neural networks themselves might need to go through nightly training exercises when it's switched off from normal inputs. So even AIs may need to sleep and dream, an interesting concept. Have you ever noticed that if you actually think about something, you actually can be worse than if you don't think? And that is where you may have trained your subconscious to do something, and if you actually start thinking about it, then you actually become worse because it's actually more effort. For me, an example of bowling is actually I'm much better at bowling when I don't think. So think of the brain as being collections of experiences, and in the subconscious mind, those collections are reinforced when we repeat activities, when we repeat learning how to ride the bicycle. And the conscious mind is effectively learning how to learn, learning how to create those repeated experiences in the subconscious mind, or experiencing something for the first time and then realizing it. So in our brain we hold billions of collections of patterns which are effectively memories or experiences. And when we experience something new, we will try and match with previous experiences, and that helps us predict what's going to happen next, and that is effectively a thought. Now, how do we actually have new thoughts or new ideas? This is where we actually might compare a number of patterns together and correlate two different experiences, and that might create a new idea or a new concept. Let's give an example of this. When I was creating the ideas for this video, I experienced lots of reading articles about AI and watching videos on AI. These each became lots of experiences, and then I started putting those experiences together as thought processes and ended up with perhaps new concepts or concepts that actually others have already thought of. So in reality, there is no magic in AI predicting an event or even creating new ideas. all can be achieved by appropriate programming. Conscious thought is indeed possible to recreate using a computer, and of course use massive amounts of data. And all this means our future conscious AIs will need to sleep and dream in order to reinforce or learn machine learning patterns. And that's it for this week. Please like, subscribe and comment below, and if you want, visit the Patreon link. See you next week.